On my 72nd birthday, my son invited me on a cruise. I took it as a sign he still cared. Yet on the second night, a young server slid a napkin beneath my fingertips, hidden by the tablecloth. In hurried ink it read, "Call 911, there is something in your tea." My fingers went numb. My own child. I wanted to blame confusion, to tell myself I'd misread, but in the quiet centre of me I already knew. So what do you do when the person you brought into this world decides yours is expendable? That morning, the morning I turned 72, I discovered a small envelope beneath my door. No card, no scrawl of ink, only a printed note, pack warm. Boat leaves Friday at 10 a.m. It was from Darren, my son. I hadn't heard his voice in nearly 4 years. No calls, no holiday greetings. Not even a message when a spike in my blood pressure threw me into the ER last winter. So when that note appeared, I couldn't tell if my heart should leap or brace. I sat at my kitchen table a long time, just looking at the paper. My coffee went cold. The toast never got touched. All I could ask was, why now? And yet, maybe, just maybe, he was different. 2 days later, I stood on the Annapolis pier, one hand locked around my scarf, telling myself not to spiral. The ship Darren booked wasn't flashy. No floating mall, no neon. A local line, cosy. A few families trundled aboard with roller bags and sleepy children. And there he was, my boy, with that old smile I hadn't seen since his wedding day. Beside him stood Liana, sleek and polished as ever. She offered me a half hug, the kind you give a neighbour you barely know. The cabin they'd arranged surprised me. Soft blankets. A framed photo of the three of us from years ago. A small shelf stocked with my favourite authors. It felt deliberate, as though someone had asked about me, remembered me. That evening at dinner they flanked me, one on each side. Before I could reach for water, Liana poured me chamomile. Darren sectioned my salmon as if I might drop the knife. It was thoughtful and strange. I wasn't used to being tended to, certainly not by them. They asked about my bookstore, about the monthly readings I still hosted for the seniors, even the nights I volunteered at the literacy centre. They listened, or wore the mask of listening well. Darren actually laughed when I told him our mayor had been caught reading bodice rippers in the non-fiction aisle. Later, back at my window, I watched the water ribbon past and felt something I hadn't in years. Maybe it was peace. Maybe hope. I reminded myself not to trust too fast. Still, it felt like Darren was making an effort. I wanted this trip to mean something. But those of you with a few decades on your back know the texture of silence when it sharpens, how it presses into a room without a sound. I couldn't name it that night, but some inner part of me went on watch. Sometimes the stillest water hides the turn of the storm. Let me bring you to night too. That was when the tea soured. That was when threads began to pull free. That's when I realised this birthday trip wasn't truly about celebrating me at all. Not really. The second morning snapped cold. Outside my cabin window, the bay lay flat as polished glass. I woke early, not from excitement, but because my body felt weighted. There was a tight band across my chest, and my fingers tingled when I braced on the sink. I blame sea air and age. Stretch, I told myself. You probably slept funny. We took breakfast in the smaller dining room, fewer faces, lower voices. No Darren. But Liana greeted me with sunshine and steered me to the window. She placed a steaming mug in my hands, said it was a blend she'd picked up in Charleston, good for nerves. It smelled of mint and something damp, earthy. I sipped to be polite. Half a cup was enough to cloud my head. Not dizzy, not spinning, just dimmed, as though someone thumbed down the rheostat on my mind. I blinked hard and fixed on Liana's mouth as she spoke about cruises and reconnection. She said my first name often, with an extra softness. You deserve pampering, she told me. You've poured yourself into everyone else for so long. Her words landed like velvet, but something in the cadence felt rehearsed. Then she asked about my medications, whether I still took the small blue pills for blood pressure. I nodded and pretended not to notice how her gaze flicked to her phone, thumbs moving quick. By afternoon, we drifted up to the top deck. The breeze combed through my hair and lightened the fog, but the fatigue clung like damp wool. I leaned on the rail and watched the shoreline slide by. Darren appeared with a lemonade.
It tasted a shade off.
Not terrible. Just wrong. I set it down and asked for water. Leanna, quick as a stage cue, produced a chilled bottle from her tote. Dinner that night was in the captain's lounge, candlelight, soft music, a seafood dish I couldn't pronounce. My appetite skittered. I pushed food around while Darren talked about his new software venture, crypto-adjacent jargon and fizz. I nodded politely as most of it blew past. For dessert, Leanna reached for the teapot again. Different blend, she said. Lavender chamomile, great for digestion. She poured, stirred in honey, and slid the cup toward me like an offering. Her tone stayed even, but her eyes never left the porcelain. I lifted it, felt the warmth seep into my fingers, brought it near, faked a sip, and set it down. She smiled like we'd shared a secret. Back in my room, the haze returned heavier. I perched on the bed's edge, heart fluttering, weak wings at a window. My belly cramped once, then again. I lay back, breathed slow. It eased, but the low hum of unease stayed humming. I stood and faced the mirror. My skin looked sapped. Not exactly sick, but not me. A small tremor ran down my right hand as I brushed a grey strand aside. I didn't remember shaking before this trip. The wind lifted outside. The curtains swayed. Far down the corridor, a door clicked shut. I hardly slept. My mind drifted through half-dreams while a question, quiet and stubborn, refused to settle. By dawn, I knew something was wrong, and I also knew I had to keep acting as though nothing was. Not yet. The third night's dinner sat under a drift of piano jazz. Tables ringed the musician in a soft semicircle, and by then most passengers had collected familiar faces for dessert and stories. I kept to myself, watching the candles make tiny fires in the glassware. Leanna and Darren arrived late. She brushed my cheek with a kiss and whispered that I looked rested. Darren sat heavy, rubbing his temples and muttering about the swell. I smiled and offered nothing. The waiter pushed a house specialty. I declined wine. Leanna coaxed me toward a ginger pear spritzer instead. I let her pour. Bubbles rose and vanished too quickly. Mid-meal I excused myself, not because I needed the restroom, but because the fog was back and the walls felt too close. The hallway was dim, hung with framed prints of old ships and browned clippings from past voyages. As I returned, something tugged my attention. A young waitress, 22 at most, stood near the service cart, hands flying as she folded napkins. Her eyes weren't on her work. They followed Leanna. As I passed, she looked straight at me, lips flattened to a seam. I reached my chair and saw it. Tucked under my folded napkin was a sliver of paper. No envelope, torn edge, a few shaky pen strokes. "Call 911, there is something in your tea." My throat cinched. For a heartbeat, I thought my own heart had quit. I blinked and read it again, slower. The letters were rushed, the ink a little smeared. I lifted my gaze, calm, slow. No one was watching. I slid the paper into my purse and draped the napkin back over my plate, as though nothing at all had happened. My hands trembled in my lap, not from age, from fear. I didn't touch the spritzer again. Darren didn't notice, he was scrolling. Leanna asked whether I felt cold. I nodded. She smiled and ordered me another tea. When the cup arrived, I could smell it before it settled. Familiar but off. Chamomile braided with something faintly metallic, a sweetness that shouldn't be there. Wilted blossoms and copper pennies. I thanked the waiter, let the porcelain steam and kept the mask on. Later, behind my locked cabin door, I sat under the small reading lamp and unfolded the note. This time I let the panic in. Questions pounded, but instinct spoke louder. Someone had seen. Someone chose to warn me. I replayed the evening beat by beat, Leanna's fingers circling my glass, Darren's careful avoidance of my eyes unless he had the floor. How they always knew where I'd been, what I'd had when I'd turned in. Coincidence felt like a costume now. This was staged, I didn't sleep. I listened to the low engine thrum, to the ship's metal bones expanding in salt air. At some dark hour, footsteps paused at my door. A soft knock. Then silence. Morning dragged itself in. My eyes were raw, the nausea heavier. Still, I dressed, did my hair, pinned on my brooch, and walked out like nothing had shifted. At breakfast, I saw the waitress again. She moved quickly, almost avoiding me, then paused. As she poured coffee for a man at the next table, she rolled her wrist, and I spotted a tiny mark near the crease of her thumb. Numbers, written in pen. A local area code. She said nothing, but our eyes touched, and the world narrowed to a single stark certainty. I was not imagining any of it. The next morning I skipped breakfast. Instead, I settled into the small balcony chair outside my cabin, wrapped in a cardigan, and watched the fog breathe over the water in slow ribbons. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. The note from last night lay folded on the table beside me, already soft at the creases from how often I'd opened and closed it. I hadn't truly slept, just drifted for minutes at a time with my ears pricked for footsteps, doors, any change in the hallway. But it was the silence that did the most damage. In the quiet, my thoughts grew louder. I replayed the dining room again and again. Every smile from Leanna, every cup she placed in front of me, each time Darren insisted on escorting me back to my room. I'd dismissed too much as courtesy. I couldn't afford to ignore a single detail now. A little before 10, I left my cabin and headed to the mid-deck cafe. I had no desire to return to the formal dining room, too exposed, too watched. The cafe ran self-serve, and most passengers kept to their own corners. I poured myself a stark black coffee and took the far seat facing the entrance. I didn't have to wait long. The same young waitress from last night glided in with a tray of pastries. She scanned the room, found me, and drifted to a nearby table. She straightened a napkin, brushed away a few crumbs, then leaned just slightly toward my chair. Her voice was low and quick. I caught only fragments. She said she studied pharmacology, that she'd seen my daughter-in-law adding something to my cup, 2 nights running. She hadn't intended to get involved, but what she'd witnessed last night had turned her stomach. Then she slipped a folded scrap under my saucer and moved away without looking back. I didn't unfold it until I was safely in my cabin. The message was short. A name dioxin, a warning. It could mimic the signs of heart failure in older adults. A suggestion: get a blood panel as soon as I could. I sat slowly on the bed, staring at the word, dioxin. I didn't know the drug intimately, but I knew enough. Years ago, one of the book club ladies lost a grandson to a cardiac medication overdose. The tragedy had been quiet, insidious, much like this. The door clicked. My heart lurched. Darren stepped in, all casual smiles. He mentioned he hadn't seen me at breakfast, asked how I was feeling. I nodded lightly, keeping my expression smooth. He chatted about the view, the breeze, the food, small talk in a thick coat. Then he said something that cinched a band around my ribs. He and Leanna had been looking into new care options for me. Maybe it was time to stop running the store. Maybe someplace in Sarasota, quieter, easier and close to them, would be better. I kept my face neutral. He continued. They'd already toured a condo on my behalf. He smiled wider and told me not to worry. They'd handle the paperwork. I thanked him and said I'd think about it. Inside, I shook. When he left, I locked the door and wedged the chair beneath the knob, a silly act on a ship full of cameras and keycards, but it gave my hands a task. I sat at the desk and opened my notebook. I wrote down everything, each meal, each symptom, every odd moment since the cruise began. Dates, times, who was present. If I could see it on the page, I could stay a step ahead. I finally knew the truth.
They didn't know I knew.
That gave me time. Time to pretend, time to plan, time to survive. That afternoon, I walked the deck alone, keeping to the rail and the shadows. I had no energy for conversation. The ocean spread wide and bright, yet I felt confined. On a ship, there's nowhere to truly slip away. Still, I kept moving. Air in, air out. Every few minutes I checked my pulse. My heartbeat had adopted a strange, indecisive rhythm, neither calm nor racing. I told myself to be steady. Panic would only help them. When I returned, an envelope waited under my door, unmarked. Inside was a folded note, the same hand as before. No message, just a number, a mention of a burner phone, a room, 212, and a time, midnight. I didn't know who had staged it, but something in me said I had to show up. All afternoon I moved slowly and watched. At lunch, Darren brought me soup I hadn't asked for and joked about auditioning cruise cuisine for their future retirement. Leanna laughed too quickly and leaned in to dab my mouth with a napkin like I was 5. I smiled, thanked her, and didn't touch the spoon. I excused myself before dessert and left. Back in my room, I checked the deadbolt twice and returned to the desk. I extended the timeline, labelling drinks, food, sensations. I noted when the waitress first looked at me like she knew a secret I didn't. I stopped writing full sentences and started listing fragments. Minty, heavy, sweet but wrong eyes, wrist, dioxin, spritzer. I lay down fully dressed and tried to rest, counting the ship's breaths through the hull. At 11:30, I slipped into my coat, tucked the note into my pocket, and eased into the hallway. The ship groaned and sighed with motion. I walked unhurried, pausing at corners to be certain I wasn't followed. At room 212, I knocked twice, waited, then knocked once more. The door opened a sliver. Inside was dim. The only light came from a desk lamp. The waitress stood there. Her name tag read Maris. She didn't speak at first, just nodded toward a chair. Then she handed me a manila envelope. 3 photographs slid into my lap. The first, Leanna leaning over our table, decanting from a small brown bottle into a teacup. The second, Darren outside a pharmacy clutching a prescription bag. The third, my cabin door stamped with a timestamp, the faint outline of a hand slipping something beneath it. Maris said she had a friend in security. She'd seen too much to stay quiet. She shouldn't have obtained these stills, but she believed I was in danger. She'd already sent digital copies to a trusted person in case anything happened to either of us. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I traced the glossy edges with my thumb and let the proof settle. Pieces I'd suspected now had weight. I thanked her. She pressed a small voice recorder into my palm and told me to keep it hidden. Safer than a call if I needed to capture a conversation. Then she escorted me to the hall and disappeared through a service door without another word. Back in my cabin, a strange calm cut through me. It felt like a storm had just rained itself out, but I knew better. The real front was rolling in. I would need to be ready. The next day arrived with sun, and the soft chime of silverware drifting up from the breakfast deck. Through my window the world looked beautiful, ordinary. My mind refused ordinary. I didn't touch the tray they delivered. I logged the time and each item, scrambled eggs, melon slices, a croissant, a small glass of orange juice. I sniffed the juice, then poured it down the sink and rinsed the cup twice. From now on, nothing reached my mouth unless my hands had prepared it. I tucked the photos and Maris's envelope beneath my blouse and slipped the recorder into my left coat pocket. I checked the device 3 times before noon to make sure the light still winked to life. I didn't press record yet. I was waiting for a moment that would matter. By mid-morning, we docked at a small harbour town. Passengers streamed off for trinkets and excursions. Darren knocked, asking if I wanted to walk the pier with them. I said I was tired. He offered to bring something back. I asked for a scarf or a book. After he left, I counted to 600. Then I took the side stairs to the lower crew deck. Maris had scribbled a code on the inside flap of her last note, directions to a service panel near the laundry chute. Behind it, a small locked cabinet. Inside, a prepaid phone and a folded sheet. The note listed a name, a number, and the word lawyer. I returned to my cabin and waited. The silence felt expectant, like a held breath. I opened my notebook and added what I'd learned. Then I wrote questions. Why now? Why a cruise? What's next? Around 3, Leanna knocked. She breezed in with a smile and a little shopping bag. She said she'd found something lovely in town, a silk scarf, blue and cream, light as air. I thanked her. She set the bag on the chair and sat opposite me, voice sweet, eyes unblinking. She asked how I felt. I said better. She nodded, crossed her legs and leaned closer. She said she and Darren had been thinking long-term. They could help with everything. Medical care, legal matters, maybe even transfer a few house documents early, just to be safe. My fingers curled into my sweater hem. I kept my expression at rest. She reached into her bag and produced a thin manila envelope. Only a few forms, she said. Nothing final, just drafts. She didn't press. She set it on the table like a brochure. I told her I'd look after dinner. She smiled, rose and left. The envelope sat untouched until evening. When I dressed, I slid it into my tote alongside my notebook and the photos. If something went wrong, I wanted everything with me. Down in the dining room, Darren greeted me with a glass of wine already poured. I nodded, set it on the tablecloth and didn't drink. They watched. I could feel it. They didn't know I had started watching back. They didn't know the recorder was already humming in my cardigan's side pocket. That night the room felt thinner. A few passengers had disembarked at the last port and never rejoined us. Those who remained spoke in hushed clusters, silver-tapping porcelain. Our table for 3 waited. Darren swirled his wine and told me about an urgent meeting next week. They might have to cut the trip short. Leanna agreed, sighing about unavoidable timing and golden opportunities. I nodded. They were laying tracks, planting the idea of an early exit. The waiter set down a teapot without asking. Not for the table. Only for me. A delicate white cup with a gold rim. A pot with its handle wrapped in cloth. Leanna kept her hand near it for a beat, then lifted and poured. She didn't meet my eyes. "It'll help you sleep," she murmured. I cupped the warmth and held it. I didn't drink. Instead, I asked about the envelope she'd left. Darren called it routine estate planning, easier to sort now than later. Leanna added that they wanted to spare me stress, to give me peace. I thanked them, said I'd consider it, and smiled. The recorder kept listening. Back in my cabin, I locked the door and finally opened the envelope. Inside, preliminary transfer papers, a power of attorney draft, property forms, bank authorizations, unsigned but annotated with sticky flags marking where my initials should go. The legal language was clear enough. Darren would gain control over my financial accounts. He would make medical decisions if needed. Leanna would be my emergency contact for legal correspondence. The last page was a typed letter to my attorney, framed as my choice to consolidate assets under Darren's care. Voluntary, sensible. I sat a long time. Then I tucked everything back into the envelope and slid it beneath my suitcase lining. I didn't rip anything up. I needed the intact truth. Just after midnight, I returned to the crew deck. Maris met me at the service stairs and handed me a flash drive. Her security friend had scraped what footage he could. She warned that some angles were missing, but the clips showed enough. Leanna in the hallway, slipping something under my door. Darren in the lounge passing a folded note to a waiter, handwriting matching the warning I'd received early on, a blur of a brown bottle half hidden in Leanna's purse. I didn't thank her with words this time. I simply nodded. Back in my room, I buried the drive under cotton pads and spare toothbrushes in my toiletries bag. I sat on the edge of the bed, shoes still on, and listened to the ship hum its way through the dark. There would be no turning back. Whatever came next, I would meet it with clear eyes. The morning after the flash drive, the ocean lay almost motionless, bright and glassed over. Outside everything was still. Inside me everything had sharpened. No more confusion. No more benefit of the doubt. I had a name, a chronology, and evidence, and now I had a plan. I dressed deliberately. Navy blouse with long sleeves to hide the recorder, slacks with deep pockets for the drive and photos. I placed every piece Maris had given me into my tote, then added the estate drafts. They would not expect me to carry those. Late morning, I went to the reception deck to schedule time with ship staff. I asked for the onboard legal liaison. 10 minutes later, a young officer named Givens arrived and guided me to a small conference room behind the administrative hall. He was courteous, formal, and just skeptical enough. I spread the photos, notes, drive, and unsigned documents across the table. I didn't dramatize. I told him plainly. I believed I'd been drugged over several days. My son and daughter-in-law had tried to manipulate my health and perception to gain control of my estate. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I stated facts. He reviewed everything in silence, then asked to take the drive to the chief of security. I agreed. He also offered to place a secure satellite call to my attorney in Maryland. I gave him the name and number. When we finished, I didn't return to my room. I waited in the quiet of the ship's library. By lunch, Darren found me with a bright smile. He said they'd been looking everywhere and asked if I'd like to eat with them on the upper deck. I stood and followed. At the table, Leanna poured iced tea from a chilled carafe. In a soft pink dress with matching lipstick and earrings, she looked composed, even serene. Only her eyes flicked, once, twice, toward my tote. We had made it halfway through our plates when the pivot arrived. A crew member approached, someone I hadn't seen before, and asked Darren and Leanna to come with him. The captain needed a brief word. Nothing urgent, just protocol. Their smiles faltered, then returned. Darren touched my shoulder and promised he'd be right back. I stayed in my seat and finished the tea I had poured myself. The breeze kicked up. I drew my sweater closer. 30 minutes later, Officer Givens reappeared and asked me to come with him. This time the room felt colder, more official. He said the medical officer and security team had reviewed enough footage to corroborate the essentials. The pharmacy bag, the tea, the pattern of isolation. Not conclusive, but deeply suspicious. Darren and Leanna were being questioned separately. They weren't under arrest, but they'd been confined to their cabins until we reached the next port. He asked whether I wanted to press charges. I told him, not yet. First I needed to speak with my lawyer and get home. He nodded. Dinner that night, I chose solitude. Maris passed once to refill water. Our eyes met, and she gave the smallest nod. That was all. Back in my room, I finally slept, deeply without waking. The storm had split. But more weather waited, and I knew it. I would not wait to be saved. The next morning we docked at the final port before the turn back to Maryland. The sky hung low and heavy, as if it, too, was holding its breath. I stood on the upper deck in a grey windbreaker, watching passengers descend with plastic bags and rolling suitcases. I carried only my tote, zipped with the envelope inside. I'd already spoken to my attorney the night before. The call was short and cutting. She confirmed what I feared. Darren had contacted her office 2 weeks earlier, requesting copies of my trust and a durable power of attorney form. He hadn't reported me ill. He'd suggested I was declining, slipping. He'd asked if the trust could be amended without me present, provided he had the right authorization. I didn't cry. Not then. At 10:30 I walked to the main lounge where the cruise director hosted a farewell reception. Most came for mimosas and last photos. I came for something else. Through Officer Givens, I'd asked the captain for 15 minutes, just enough to make a personal announcement. Nothing dramatic. I wanted to thank the staff and recognize a quiet act of integrity. They agreed. The microphone felt almost weightless. I stood in front of the room with steady shoulders and dry palms. I thanked the crew. Then I said journeys reveal character, not by grand gestures, but by how people move when they think no one sees. I spoke slowly. No names. but made it clear that someone had chosen truth when silence would have been safer. I called Maris forward. She froze, unsure, then stepped out from near the espresso machine, eyes wide. I smiled and handed her a small envelope. Inside was a scholarship certificate. No one on that ship knew, not even Maris, that years ago my husband and I had supported a small foundation for women in science and healthcare. 2 nights earlier I'd called, explained the urgency, asked for a late application. They said yes. The award would cover her final year, tuition and living costs. Her reaction was quiet. No tears, no speech. But her hands shook as she hugged me, then she slipped back into the rhythm of the staff like mist. I stepped down to polite applause. I wasn't watching the guests. I was watching my son and his wife. They stood near the back wall, faces blank. Darren folded his arms. Leanna clutched her purse to her ribs. Neither moved. Neither spoke. Later, I met Officer Givens one last time. I gave him the original envelope, the recordings and the flash drive. I said I would not press charges yet. I asked him to file a report and send everything to my attorney. I also passed him a letter I'd written to Darren and Leanna. I had no intention of delivering it myself. Silence would say more. That night, I slept in a small inn on shore, a quiet room above the water. No thrum under my feet, no footsteps in the hall. Only my own breath, steady and mine. In the dark, I pulled my notebook from my bag and tore out the pages with their names. I didn't burn them. I folded each sheet twice, set the stack in the nightstand drawer and closed it. I had already stepped into a different place. 3 weeks later, I would sit in my attorney's office and rewrite the future. But that was still to come. For now I knew this much. The real storm had only just begun, and I was ready to face it with both eyes open. 3 weeks after I stepped off that ship, I found myself once again seated in my attorney's office, the same room where Richard and I had first signed our wills decades ago, back when we laughed easily and believed 90 sounded ancient. Sunlight stretched across the carpet in long amber stripes. The air smelled faintly of paper, ink and old leather, grounding, familiar. Across the desk, Janice slid a stack of updated documents toward me. No rush, no drama. Just deliberate, careful work. I had asked her to start over completely. Every prior designation naming Darren or Leanna was erased. Their names vanished. Not on the health proxy, not on the deed, not in the charitable trust Richard and I had built for literacy programs. The bookstore I'd run for 32 years would belong to the community foundation after I was gone. They'd keep it open, keep the readings, keep the shelves lined with poetry and dust and laughter. I initialed every page with a steady hand. Janice, calm as always, asked again whether I wished to pursue criminal charges now that we had more proof from the cruise line. I told her no, not yet. I wanted her to keep it all, though. The photos, the recordings, the correspondence. Securely stored, quietly waiting if ever it was needed. But I refused to build my remaining years around their deceit. That wasn't the story I wanted to live. When I left her office, I didn't head home right away. I walked instead to the bookstore. Not to work, just to sit. Cora, my new assistant manager, was unpacking fresh arrivals and hanging posters for an author night. She waved. I waved back. I sank into the old armchair in the corner, the one with the frayed armrest I never had reupholstered, because Richard once tore it reaching for a pen. The fabric still carried the shape of his hand. A woman in her 50s wandered through the aisles, bought a memoir and paused before leaving. She looked at me as if she recognized something. "You were on that cruise," she said softly. "I remember your speech in the lounge." She didn't pry. She just placed her hand over her heart and said, "I've never forgotten that moment." Then she left. I stayed sitting, letting the quiet of the shop wrap around me. The smell of books, the faint hum of the heater, the soft creak of floorboards, all of it felt like home reclaiming itself. That night, I brewed a pot of mint tea. The real kind. No syrup, no honey, no strange sweetness. Just hot water and leaves. I wrapped myself in a quilt at the kitchen table, listening to the hush of the house. It was mine again. Entirely mine. I had changed the locks the day after I returned and hired someone to install security cameras. Nothing excessive, just precaution. I didn't tell anyone. Some nights I still woke at 3, pulse fluttering. I would lie still in the dark and listen to nothing until calm returned. Darren left one voicemail the day after the cruise ended, his voice low, apologetic. He said he was sorry if I'd been confused, that they'd only wanted what was best for me, that he hoped I'd understand someday. I deleted it after the first listen. There was nothing left to hear. In the back of my closet, beneath a box of winter scarves, I kept a printed copy of the cruise manifest. My name circled. Beneath it, in my own handwriting, you survived. You remembered. You rebuilt. And still, you are here. Spring came late that year, but when it finally bloomed, it painted everything in soft gold. The bookstore's front windows caught the light, and Cora had moved the poetry shelf to face the door. Every morning, the air smelled of ink and sunshine. I walked more now, not for fitness, not for errands, just to feel my feet connect with the earth again. Sometimes I passed the old cafe Richard and I used to haunt on Sunday mornings. The awning had faded, but it still striped the sidewalk the same way it had for decades. One Thursday, a large envelope arrived in the mail. The return address made my stomach tighten. It was from Darren and Leanna's lawyer. Inside was a letter, polished, impersonal. They planned to contest the trust changes. They claimed undue influence, implying I'd been manipulated on the cruise, coerced into rewriting my estate. No direct accusations, just carefully worded suspicion. At the end, their attorney recommended mediation before escalation. I didn't shake. I called Janice. When I finished reading the letter aloud, she laughed. A quiet, knowing exhale. She told me not to worry. We had every piece we needed. The cruise investigation files, the transcripts, the photographs, the voice recordings, even Darren's draft letter he never realised I'd saved. Still, sleep eluded me that night. Not from fear, but from the echo of old grief. Betrayal doesn't die easily. It lingers in the ribs. So I sat at my kitchen table and opened my notebook to a clean page. For the first time since the trip, I began to write again. Not about poison or deceit, but about resilience. I wrote about the moment I set down that cup. About standing in that small ship conference room with my back straight and voice calm. About Maris, blending back into the crowd with her head a little higher. These were the memories worth keeping. The legal process didn't stretch on long. Janice sent a firm reply, accompanied by the full investigation package, sworn statements from the ship's staff, and notarized estate revisions. Every signature had been witnessed, every update done in clarity and choice. 3 weeks later, another envelope arrived. Inside was a single sheet. Darren and Leanna had withdrawn their claim. 2 sentences, 1 word at the bottom, resolved. I placed that letter in a file marked final. I didn't tuck it in the fireproof safe. I didn't need to. That weekend I hosted a quiet gathering at the bookstore, nothing elaborate. Just neighbours, retired teachers, and Maris. She'd driven in from campus, voice steadier now, posture strong. She handed me a small glass jar filled with loose peppermint and lemon balm. The handwritten tag said, "Safe and mine." We sat in the back corner, sipping tea that tasted of real citrus and calm. For the first time in months, I felt my lungs open all the way. By autumn, the trees on my street burned orange and gold, leaves holding on longer than usual. I took morning walks in my wool coat, the same one I'd worn on the cruise. Now it smelled of old books and crisp air instead of fear. Life didn't revert to what it was. It became something quieter, clearer. I donated half my belongings, kept only what felt alive in my hands or heavy with meaning. Repainted the kitchen walls, stopped setting 3 places at the table. I even replaced the family portrait above the fireplace with a framed quote I'd copied on handmade paper. I am not what was done to me. I am what I chose to do after. Cora helped me digitize the store's inventory. We revived poetry nights, smaller now but richer. Some evenings we had more candles than guests, but those who came stayed late and spoke freely. People who had always stayed silent began reading aloud. Voices cracked. Smiles softened. Something gentle was rebuilding itself there, word by word. Maris wrote every month, short updates from school, hospital shifts, research progress. In one note she said she'd changed her thesis topic. Now she was studying long-term metabolic effects of low-dose cardiac drug exposure. She ended with a single line. I never pour tea for anyone without watching their eyes. I wrote back, you make me proud. I mean it. I never heard from Darren or Leanna again. Word drifted through the bank that they'd moved. A smaller town, quieter life. Once, I wondered if they ever looked at each other differently now, if guilt had hardened or hollowed them. But I folded that thought and put it away. I had no room left for imagining lives that had chosen to leave mine. By winter, my days found rhythm. I woke without dread. I sorted mail without scanning for threats. One evening, sitting by the window, I opened my notebook again and wrote just one line. You outlived the poison. Now live like you never drank it. The world would never know everything I endured, and it didn't need to. But I would remember the woman who sat surrounded by smiles and chose not to drink. That choice saved more than my life. It brought me back to myself. If you've ever looked around and wondered what hides behind someone's easy grin, you aren't alone. Survival isn't always loud. Sometimes it's one quiet decision at a time. If this story stirred something in you, tell me in the comments. And if you've ever walked away from chaos or chosen silence as peace, this space is yours too. You're seen here. You're remembered. Sometimes when I walk past the harbour now, I stop for a moment and let the wind brush my cheek. The smell of salt and diesel still drifts up from the docks, and somewhere out there ships still glide toward horizons they'll never reach. I think about that voyage sometimes, not with fear anymore, but with a kind of wary gratitude. It taught me something that no poem, no sermon, no book ever could, that trust, once cracked, never disappears. It just teaches you how to listen differently. I've become gentler, not softer. There's a difference. I no longer give my time to people who see kindness as weakness, yet I still hold space for strangers, for small grace. Maybe that's what surviving really is, not turning to stone, but becoming deliberate about what deserves your warmth. Once a week, I visit the literacy centre, the same one I used to volunteer for before all of this. Some of the seniors there still call me Book Lady. I bring donated paperbacks, help them fill out forms, read letters from grandchildren. Every so often, one of them asks how my family is. I just smile and say, smaller but peaceful. And that's the truth. At the bookstore, we've added a community shelf. People leave notes tucked between novels, tiny stories, apologies, confessions, gratitude. We call it the quiet shelf. It started as a whim, but it's become a ritual. Readers swap pieces of themselves and never sign names. Some days I find a folded scrap that says, still healing. Some days it's, thank you for reminding me I matter. I never remove them. They belong there, side by side with the stories that saved them. One rainy evening, a young couple came in, soaked and laughing, looking for travel guides. When they reached the counter, the woman noticed the faint tremor in my right hand as I handed back her change. She smiled kindly and said, storms leave their mark, don't they? I nodded and said, they do, but they also clear the air. She grinned like she understood. Sometimes survival isn't about staying alive. It's about rebuilding a life that feels worth the effort. I used to think aging meant losing pieces of yourself, watching the world move faster than you could keep up. But now I see it differently. Aging, if you're lucky, is a chance to curate, to strip away the noise and keep only what sings. There are mornings when I wake before dawn and brew tea just to watch the first light pour through the kitchen window. I lift the cup, breathe in the steam, and whisper, "Safe." It's such a small word, but it carries the weight of every heartbeat that almost wasn't. Darren and Leanna became ghosts in my story, still existing somewhere but no longer written into my pages. Forgiveness hasn't arrived, and maybe it never will. But peace has, and that's enough. Every year on my birthday I close the bookstore early. I set a single candle on the counter, open the guest book and write a line to myself. Last year's line was simple. You stayed. This year's will be longer, I think. Something about courage and quiet, about how silence, when chosen, is not weakness but wisdom.